United States. Dr. Chapman is an Associate Professor of Health and Biomedical Informatics at the University of Melbourne. As a cancer survivor in childhood and adulthood, his experiences as a patient have shaped his work as a teacher and researcher. Louise likes to refer to Brian as our health informatics philosopher in residence. Please give a resounding welcome to Associate Professor Brian Chapman.
Well, I'm excited to be here. I think I should get the award for the shirt that most closely matches the Medinfo 23 logo. And as you heard, if this is going to hit advance. Oh, now I'm backwards. Okay, so can I go backwards? Is that? Okay, well, as I was introduced, I have a PhD in medical informatics, but that's not why I'm invited to speak. I'm invited to speak because foremost I'm a patient. My wife says I'm never happier than when I'm in a clinical office. Because I'm a childhood cancer survivor, I've had the opportunity over time and space to have a variety of healthcare experiences. And as probably like all surgical patients, I have a certain mobile medical record that I always have with me. It's just unfortunately not computable. Let's see. I make no claim to be representative of patients. I'm idiosyncratic. How many patients would take their CT scans of their remaining kidney and make jewelry out of it as a coping mechanism for their chronic renal failure, or would be very interested in sharing my SNOMED CT codes as hashtags for my social media? I've managed to accrue some of my medical record going back to my childhood, including the bill from my birth. How much did your circumcision cost? Mine cost $5.50. We can talk about consent at another time. For this talk, I would like to channel the great Jewish theologian and civil rights activist Abraham Heschel, who wrote, "Prayer is meaningless unless it is subversive." To which I would like to say, a keynote is meaningless unless it is subversive. And what I would like to claim that I think is subversive is that the information problems that patients face is rooted in a fateful decision that modern medicine made over a century ago. And that is, instead of following the transparency and acknowledgement of uncertainty that its scientific foundations would have suggested, instead, medicine decided to follow the ancient dictate to not disclose. A dictum that was rooted in the fact that ancient medicine had to hide its ignorance and its uncertainty. So in 1964, the American Medical Association, as part of its annual meeting in San Francisco, organized a session called The Patient as a Person, and Abraham Heschel was invited to speak. I picture him at the lectern saying, "I assert that every patient is in fact a person." Now, my time-traveling self, sitting back in 1964, I picture as being puzzled. Why is this even something we have to assert, that a patient is always a person? But I have talked to enough clinicians over the years to not have a difficulty imagining at least some people in that audience laughing at this concept of a patient is a person. Well, what's a patient and what's a person? I often use Uwe Reinhardt's claim that a patient is a biological structure yielding cash. Much of modern medicine is built on the reductionism that a patient is a biological structure reducible to interconnected physiological systems. But for the purpose of this talk, I would say a functional definition of a patient is a biological structure that is assumed cannot understand their medical care without an intermediary. What's a person? That's a hard problem to answer too, but I would say that at a minimum, a person is a being with imagination, values, and agency, and these all invoke the conclusion that they are a being with epistemic needs and epistemic rights. Well, what do I mean by those? Well, epistemic rights are the rights to data, information, knowledge, and understanding, particularly related to ourselves, and the right to share those in a way that advances our purposes. And epistemic injustices occur when something impedes us. And so hermeneutical injustice is something that impedes us from self-understanding. Testimonial injustice is something that impedes us from sharing. And it is really that hermeneutical injustice that interests me. If this seems abstract, think of hermeneutical injustice as living in a police state like East Germany, or being a character in a Kafka novel. And testimonial injustice is the stereotypical minority giving testimony in court only to be ignored because of who he is. Now, before I got into medicine, I was in physics. And physicists are famous for studying cows, but only if they're spheres. Now, this is a joke that's made about the sometimes extreme simplifications that physicists make in order to allow their mathematical models to match the universe. And I think that similarly in healthcare, we're often prone to the same simplification and say all patients are spheres. I want to be clear, not biological spheres. We're very good at differentiating the physiological and pathological needs of patients and designing interventions for them as individual biological entities. But as information spheres, whose information needs are all the same and are all simple. That's the patient's spheres that I'm talking about. And against that simplification, I want to bring the voice of the American philosopher William James and take what he wrote about religion and translate that to medicine or health. James wrote, "Ought it indeed to be assumed that the lives of all men should show identical health information elements? In other words, is the existence of so many patient types and sects and creeds regrettable? To these questions I answer no emphatically. And my reason is I do not see how it is possible that creatures in such different positions and with such different powers as human individuals are should have exactly the same functions and the same duties. If an Emerson were forced to be a Wesley or a Moody forced to be a Whitman, the total human consciousness of healthcare would suffer. Yet, whether I'm a monitoring patient that wants to find everything I can about my healthcare situation, or I'm a blunting patient, I don't want to know more, whether I'm happy to be on the sideline of my care, or if I want to be in the middle of the team and actively making decisions with them, whether my network of care is large, and this is mine, or smaller, which is my wife's, and they're mostly midwives, so she wasn't really sick. We're all given the same limited health information tools. Why? This assumption that patients aren't persons, patients are spheres. I've been reading Jay Katz's The Silent World of Doctor and Patient, which was written in 1980. And Katz was a psychiatrist who was a law professor at Yale University. If you don't believe that the world of the doctor and patient was silent in that era, let me offer the testimony of my mother, who, speaking of my healthcare in the 1970s, said, "They didn't tell you much back then." Katz provided a diagnosis of medicine that I view 3 points as being significant. The first I already mentioned. The second is that clinicians' own uncomfortableness with uncertainty led them to a transference of that to their patients and a feeling that they must protect and hide uncertainty from their patients. And third, they undervalue patients as persons with values and capabilities, that all patients are spheres and simple spheres. And I think, unfortunately, informatics has largely inherited these same problems that medicine set us en route for over a century ago. Now, there's been a lot that's happened since 1980. There have been internal changes in medicine that have changed the epistemic perspectives of patients. There's been a recognition of medical errors, quality issues, outcomes, where we recognize that patients are going to have an important epistemic role. There's an expanding concept of what it means to be a citizen and what a person's rights are, whether human rights are, including epistemic rights. And there's an expanding recognition of patients as persons with values distinct from clinicians and therefore in need of things like joint decision making. In the internal medical use of a patient, I think that William Wimsatt's concept of metabolizing error is very informative and fruitful. And he talks about how humans exploit parallelisms and redundancies in the process of metabolizing that error. And so patients are an obvious information parallelism source for medicine to make use of. And I have to acknowledge that medicine isn't a monolithic voice, and there have always been voices saying something different. Larry Reed, for example, wrote in Knowledge Couplers that until patients working directly from their own records are the rule instead of the exception, we cannot seriously attack the fragmentation of care in today's specialty clinics and wards. Katz wrote that to fully acknowledge someone, you need to get their strengths and their weaknesses. And physicians have been really good at recognizing patients' weaknesses as decision makers, but considerable insensitivity to their capacities as decision makers. Again, not everyone has this voice. In their classic 1980 clinical decision analysis text, Weinstein and Feinberg start with the case of the young Freeman Dyson, a brilliant physicist, who on vacation in San Diego in the 1950s was bit by a stray dog. He goes to a doctor, and as all doctors who treat physicists should have a chalkboard that they can reason through with him, they discuss the probabilities of different outcomes. The treatment at the time was not risk-free. It was about a 1 in 60 chance of death from the treatment itself. And so they were able to work through the probabilities and help Freeman Dyson make a rational decision about what his course of action should be. Now, we're not all Freeman Dyson. I'm not Freeman Dyson. I may wish I was, but I'm not. So let's go to the other extreme, the stereotypical, not very well educated patient that you hear so much about. Again, Larry Reed talks about visiting a hospital with a modern EMR, doing rounds, and then asking to be introduced to a patient that's about to be discharged. He's introduced to a woman with lupus, interviews her, concludes she doesn't know very much about her condition, and confronts the healthcare staff about this patient in light of Larry Reed's views of how patients should be treated. And they push back. Push back about not very bright, not very well educated. And Larry says, but you said she's going home this afternoon. She lives alone. At 2 p.m., you will put her in a wheelchair, give her a paper bag full of drugs, and send her out the door. Are you going home with her? No. Is her management at home our problem? You just said she could not handle it. Who will do it? The patient may not seem very well educated or very bright to you, but what could be more unintelligent than what you are doing? So what brings these together, whether you're the brilliant Freeman Dyson or the not very well educated lupus patient, as soon as you're out that clinic door or the hospital door, you have to make decisions and actions on your own. And that means you have epistemic needs that need to be satisfied. So I'm just going to offer a few of my personal perspectives on what epistemic injustices in healthcare look like in the 21st century. First, I view it as an epistemic injustice if you only give me my data as paper or a PDF. Paper would have been great in 1976. Would have been easy too, then an interoperability problem. I want my data to be fair. I move around a lot. If you look at my network, those are all the different places I've gotten healthcare, different healthcare settings. And more than anything else, I want my data to be reusable when I go to my next setting. It's not going to be that with paper. One of the examples I use in teaching is from my friend Angela, who experienced both hermeneutical injustice and testimonial injustice with the birth of her premature twins. So her twins were in the NICU for 2 months, and she describes it as being an information desert. Never seen the doctors, just prying information from nurses. But yet when she's discharged, she's given a 32-page discharge summary. The information comes to her, the data comes to her, but not when she has the need for that data for her emotional need for understanding at the time when her infants are in the hospital. Here in Australia, where I've been for about 4 years, I get to experience a certain kind of hermeneutical injustice and how it's decided for me how I get to learn about my test results. If my test results happen to be uploaded to my health record, I have to wait 7 days. Under the hypothetical reason that my doctor may call me, look at those test results and call me beforehand, something that has never happened. This is a hermeneutical injustice in my mind. When I got my first melanoma diagnosis back in around 2005, 2006, I was in a McDonald's restroom washing the syrup off of our youngest son's hands. When I answered my phone, I thought it was my wife calling me to tell me it was time to pick her up. And that's when I got the diagnosis that I had an invasive melanoma. Is a McDonald's restroom the best place to receive that information? No, it was I had a patient portal at the time. I would have rather have gotten that information through the patient portal, but it was decided for me by the health system that this information was provided by phone. I rather would have gotten it from phone than wait several days, because as soon as that biopsy is taken, my imagination is running full speed until the actual information comes to stop, and then I can move on from there. My daughter, Claire, introduced me to the poet Andrea Gibson, who is an ovarian cancer survivor. And in a podcast that Claire shared with me, Andrea talks about how empowering it has been to her to be able to read her diagnoses and prognoses through the portal. And to her, it was always something disempowering about having a doctor tell her. I know that not everyone feels that way, although the open notes talk on Sunday would indicate that most patients probably feel this way. And the key point is what works for you, what works for her, and who's deciding. Is it the patient value that says it has to be in person or on a phone call, or is it the clinician value? Is it something that's good for the patient, or is it something that's good for the clinician? I think it's a 21st century epistemic injustice when countries do not educate their citizenry to be with the basic literacies necessary to function in our healthcare systems. And then when we blame patients, because much of patients' health literacy is in part a consequence and a product of the very health system that they are trying to work in. And so we create the health illiteracy and then we blame them for their health illiteracy. So to me, when we look at how much every country is struggling with delivering and paying for healthcare, I think that we should be thinking of this as a Sputnik moment and really rethinking what are the existential threats to our societies and how can we educate our citizenry to address those. And I think the cost and the quality of healthcare is an existential threat, and we should be thinking about from primary school on, how are we preparing citizens to operate in this? And there are some examples of, like in Germany, there's a program, I don't know if it still exists, Science Kids, where the health program treats, instead of moralistic preaching, don't have sex, don't get pregnant, treats them as scientists and teaches them to be curious about health and how health interacts with the healthcare system. So patients are indeed widely variable persons, and I claim that health systems commit epistemic injustices when they decide for the patient how the patient can interact or not with their data, when health systems do not provide mechanisms for patients to utilize their own data, and when health systems do not provide tools, digital or otherwise, whether it's basic knowledge, for patients to understand the data about their healthcare. If we go way back to 1973, in fact, the actual month that I started kindergarten, the New England Journal of Medicine published an article called "Giving the Patient His Medical Record, a Proposal to Improve the System." And in this article, they kind of predict that if you give patients their data, give them their record, there will be a marketplace that will grow of health information services that persons can draw upon to make them better patients. At this conference, we've seen a lot and heard a lot about this marketplace growing, but I think we have to admit that it's the exception, and it's probably the rare exception of how patients get to interact with their data. I'm going to just call out our colleagues at University of Manchester because Sabine was kind enough to share her slides with me so I could use them in my lecture Monday night for my university class. So Remora is a tool for rheumatoid arthritis patients to be able to collect their data, share their data, and understand their data, and we certainly need more of those things. I'm asking you all to have some imagination and imagine differently what a patient is in the 21st century. Treat patients as 21st century persons. Give them the data. Eliminate monolithic solutions where patients are merely guests. You're never going to design a system that matches the diverse epistemic needs of all patients. A single system to rule them all. It's not going to happen. Instead, replace that monolithic system with a marketplace of solutions, William James's variety of sects and creeds that I introduced you to earlier, that patients can pick from to match their incredible inherent information variety. Thank you.